has been a broadcast of the ESO Network. Be part of the crew and help support our shows by donating to our ESO Patreon or by shopping at the TeePublic store, which can all be found at www.esonetwork.com. The ESO Network, your station for all things geek.
Look up, look down, look out. Here come the Monkees.
Mickey,
David,
Mike,
Peter.
We're talking about them in Monkeeing Around. That's right, Monkeeing Around has everything, including
interviews,
Episode reviews.
album discussions,
and other incredible surprises.
Monkeeing Around, a podcast about the Monkees. Welcome back to Monkeeing Around. This week we are joined by special guest, almost a regular now, Derek Miner. Welcome, Derek.
Hi, everybody.
We might as well make you a regular at this point, almost. Yeah.
Honorary member.
Yep, absolutely.
Thank you.
And this week we are talking about the docudrama Love and Mercy. We had watched it the Sunday before Brian passed away. So we're kind of talking about Brian Wilson and Love and Mercy and the Beach Boys Monkees adjacent today. Therefore, bonus episode. Yay.
Doing a bonus episode talking about Love and Mercy because you and I we watch a lot of biopics.
Mm-hmm.
Love and Mercy is one of the few that's actually a good movie.
Yeah,
in addition to being a
such a good
biopic, usually even bad biopics are just entertaining to watch.
Yes.
But we talked them into doing it to watch it all together because we like to get together and watch movies over to Lane's house. And then doing a bonus episode. But then, like literally 2 days after we watched it, Brian Wilson passed away. So we figured that today, his birthday, or what would have been his 83rd birthday, would be a good time to just talk about Brian Wilson, but also talk about the film Love and Mercy. There's also a lot of Monkees connections, so we'll get some Monkees talk in there as well. But yeah, I mean, it was kind of surreal. We had just watched the film about him, and then like literally just days after that, we got the news that he had passed.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was weird when I saw it on Facebook. Like, I think I was the one that let everybody know, and I was like, wait, and because I saw it on Facebook, and then I went and Googled because I was like, okay, let me make, and it was like, wow, because it was his family that had posted it, so it was like, okay, that really did happen, and so I let y'all know.
It took a while for the news media to pick it up too. It was
I know
hours before there was anything like official news media. For a long time, it was just the Instagram post.
Yeah, I was having kind of a day at work, and so I was offline for the entire day. So I picked up my daughter after work, and then we went out to dinner, and I was looking at my phone while we were waiting for our food, and I was like, what are all the notifications about? And I was like, oh, no. Like, then it's down. Are we... And we'll talk a little about, I guess, our experiences seeing Brian Wilson live as well. And I know, Derek, you have more than we have. But, I mean, I guess let's start with the film Love and Mercy, since that's what we'd originally talked about, talking about.
Yeah.
Right.
Had you guys seen Love and Mercy before we all watched it over to Lane's house?
I have. Oh.
Oh, no.
I was waiting. I didn't want to jump in until she did. Go ahead.
I had not seen it, and I don't think I had ever heard of it, to be honest. It had missed my radar, but I will admit I am sort of an on the surface Beach Boys fan. Like, I know classic Beach Boys songs. I know Kokomo. I know John Stamos got involved because I watched Full House, but it's been a very... And I know my mom had Pet Sounds, and I know my mom was a big Beach Boys fan, but I never really got into it like I'd done the Beatles or the Monkees or anybody else. So it was not on my radar to watch.
Yeah. And Derek, you said you had watched it.
Yes. I was counting down the days till it came out in the theaters and bought a ticket as soon as I could to see it.
Yeah, I don't think we saw it until it was on streaming, but it was pretty soon after it was on streaming, wasn't it? I don't remember seeing it in the theaters.
I thought we went to see it because I was also anticipating the movie because, I mean, like I said, I like biopics a lot just generally. Even bad biopics I enjoy watching, and even if it's just to pick them apart. But I mean, this is one that is actually, for me, like a legitimately good film, a good introduction to people to Brian Wilson. And because it isn't just the general biopic thing where it's like, this happened in their life, and then this happened, and this, and hitting those biopic beats. It has an interesting narrative structure, and it follows kind of an offbeat period of his life as well, which you don't often get in biopics. Usually, you'll get the origin story in a biopic, But you don't always get like when he was 40 and struggling. But that's a really interesting period of Brian Wilson's life as well. So I thought it was really good that they did that, and I really enjoyed that they had 2 different actors portraying him.
Right.
And I just thought the whole thing was just a very well made film, but also entertaining. You know, there are also like artsy films that are not particularly entertaining to watch. But I thought this one was. I think it's good. It's got comedy. It's got a love story in it. You know, like it hits those movie beats that you really want just for like an enjoyable movie watching experience.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I enjoyed watching it, even if I think if you're not a Beach Boys fan or you don't know anything about it, you would still enjoy watching it just because, especially when they're in the present, even though I know it's not present day. He's such an odd character, even though it's a real life person, that you kind of are like, okay, you're trying to figure this out. There's almost like a little mystery puzzle.
Yeah.
Like, okay, how did he go from that to this? And how's it going to finish up? And how's the Cadillac sales lady going to figure into this? You know, I mean, it was cool. I enjoyed it.
Okay.
Well, that's really interesting. Oh, sorry.
No, go right ahead.
I was just saying it's really interesting because that was going to my thought is like, how does someone who doesn't really know that story react to it? Because then you're going to have a different reaction to someone like me who knew who the people were that were the players in the story and who the Cadillac sales lady was and like what eventually ends up happening before you even go into the movie. But I was thinking kind of along the same lines like you had said there, Elaine, that I think that the way they present Brian as a character is kind of intriguing, that you kind of like wonder about like what is going on in his head, and a compelling and empathetic, well, I was going to say empathetic, but you empathize with him. He's a sympathetic character.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I really enjoyed Paul Dano. I enjoyed his performance, and really all of them who played the young Beach Boys. I thought everyone did a really great job. And you get sort of the smash cut in the beginning of like, here's the Beach Boys up to now, but you don't really get like a typical biopic where it would start with them and they're just living in California or whatever, and they like music. You know what I mean? It sort of skips over those beats in that opening montage, and then sort of gets a little psychedelic and jumps straight into. I mean, really, the story starts when Brian Wilson is having a panic attack and doesn't want to go on the plane. When he stops touring, it's really telling the story of him in the studio, rather than, you know, like what the Beach Boys story would likely do, you know, of telling that story up to that point.
Because I think this part of the Beach Boys story is really more Brian's story.
Yeah, well, it's not. Yeah, it's not a Beach Boys biopic. It's a story about Brian Wilson.
Yeah,
right. And I think it's important to kind of where they started it, where he decided not to go on tour. That kind of like the beginning of. I mean, I know he probably had issues mentally before that, but had them very well hidden, and it just finally was like, I can't do this anymore. And that shows you the beginning of the unraveling, kind of, or whatever journey he ended up going on to get to where we saw him being heavily medicated and, you know, controlled.
Right.
You know.
Yeah, it's kind of, the thought that came to my mind when you were talking, Chuck, is it's a little glib, but I was like, it's more of a biopic of Brian Wilson's mental health.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, and in a time when mental health wasn't as well understood as it is today, and particularly at that time, if you're having mental health struggles and you have access and money for psychedelics, that is perhaps not the best way to handle your mental health problems.
Is at the time, probably
acid and LSD.
I'm sure that exasperated.
Unless you want to make a classic pop album that everyone will love for 50 years.
I'm trying to remember who it was, but like somewhere in the last couple of weeks, I saw like someone had posted a clip of an interview with someone who was saying that they wish they hadn't done LSD, and they didn't recommend it for artists. So I'm trying to remember who that clip was of.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, it obviously has some negative effects on you.
Right.
You know, it's not all positive. But although, I mean, I do think that, I mean, there have been instances where it seems like the drugs help people sort of open their creativity and do strange things. Sometimes in a good way, and sometimes, you know, us sober people listen to it are like, whoa, what's going on?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But also, I'm really intrigued by the sort of the Beach Boys story at that period. And I know the issues with Mike Love. I'm pretty familiar with that. But I mean, looking at it from his perspective in the film too. I mean,
Mhm.
they're a very successful operation. They had a successful formula. They were, rivaling the Beatles in popularity. And then they go away and come back, and Brian has produced this very strange, melancholy album for them to sing on. And I think that, some of the things that he voices in the film that he would have voiced in real life, I think are legitimate. Where it's like, what are you doing? I mean, we've made our money singing about surf and sand and girls and cars and and what is this?
Yeah. Yeah. I can see that, but as somebody who listened to Pet Sounds after the fact, it's not that strange to me.
Right.
Mhm.
But that I have, you know,
You have the distance.
I have the distance
and
from
not
it.
the connection to all
Sure.
the early Beach Boy stuff. It's
Right.
interesting because that's kind of comparatively similar to the Monkees going from like the Birds, the Bees, and the Monkees and Pisces to Head.
Right.
Um,
Then further,
yeah,
I mean, because the
Yeah.
Monkees did get weirder after that.
yeah.
It's like when we watched 33 and a Third, we talked about it on this show, and I mean, stuff like Shorty Blackwell and the
Mhm.
more experimental stuff that they were trying to get into.
Right.
But I'm sure there's a lot of that kind of stuff that we look at now is like being more innovative and pushing the boundaries and things like that. But I imagine there's people who were listening to it at the time thinking like, well, this band I like just went weird.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
They're not playing the same music they've always played. They're
Right.
doing something new. I don't like it.
Right.
Yeah. It's something I can't fathom because it's like, the same thing you were saying, Lane, like the perspective, we only have the perspective of like kind of having it all together and not going in a timeline where it's
Mhm.
like, this is where we came in on the Beach Boys and it was like Surfing USA, and now here comes Pet Sounds, and what do we feel about Pet Sounds?
Mhm.
Right.
Yeah, it doesn't feel like that strange an album, but I don't know what anybody at the time would have thought about it. It definitely has a different sound. The Sirius XM temporarily brought back Beach Boys radio on one of their channels for about a week after Brian passed. And like as they, Sirius XM channels devoted to artists, you'll hear like a promo that's just got like different sound clips of different songs and stuff. And when you're going through these clips and then you hear a clip from Pet Sounds, it does sound different. It has
Mhm.
like more of a lush, open sound, and it doesn't sound as confined, I guess, as like just a general studio production of most of their stuff. I guess you're kind of getting there with California Girls and stuff, but
Mhm.
Pet Sounds definitely was a different level.
Mhm.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I grew up, like you said, with this stuff on oldies radio, and
Mhm.
they would play, Good Vibrations or Sloop John B right alongside the older
Mhm.
stuff. And, I mean, it was all just mixed and matched.
Yep.
So I didn't have that delineation in my mind just from when I was introduced to it. So, yeah, I agree. It doesn't sound that strange to me. But, yeah, I think that, there's a lot of, just as you're listening to bands in your life that are contemporary and sometimes they
Yeah.
take directions you don't like. And I think that there were probably folks who were super into it
Mhm.
and thought like the Beach
Mhm.
Boys are pushing the boundaries, But I mean, as they point out in the film, like Pet Sounds didn't sell to the degree that they would have liked it to. It wasn't a hit in the way that some of their previous stuff had been. And so, yeah, I mean, looking at it from their perspective, especially at a time when rock and pop bands were looked at as flash in the pan, like milk the money out of them while you can.
Mhm.
That
That rhymed.
then I think there would be some genuine concern from the other members of the band that like we're gonna lose it, like we're gonna fall off, like
Mhm.
you do as Mike Love says in the film and like stick to the formula and do what works and do what sells.
Right.
It's interesting because the Beatles did that successfully.
Mhm.
And I feel like the difference probably was the Beatles didn't care. They were
Mhm.
like, we're done with the fame by the time they did Sgt. Pepper because they're like, I'm not touring anymore. But the Monkees and the Beach Boys weren't
Mhm.
at that point in their lives. So it's so strange
Yeah.
how
well, you also
the
didn't-
Beatles formula continued on and just kept going, whereas it kind of petered out when the Monkees did Head and the 33s and the Thirds, and the Beach Boys did Pet Sounds.
Right, but the Beatles, I feel, were more collaborative.
Yes.
whereas here, and then they had
You got
stopped
one
touring.
person, right?
They have been touring on their previous hits, and then they come back, and Brian Wilson is sort of orchestrating this thing in the studio by
Yeah.
himself,
Yeah.
or with, himself and the studio musicians. Whereas the Beatles stopped touring, and then they were in the studio,
Yeah.
and even later on when they were not acting as a group as much as they had previously, but it wasn't like Paul stayed back in the studio while the rest of them went out and toured on their previous hits,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that there was far more investment probably from all of them. But also, there was certainly Beatles stuff that wasn't as well received. The Nashville Mystery Tour that I don't think that hit in the same way that some of their previous stuff, that it were just seemed like they were just being weird and druggies.
Yeah.
Well, also with the Monkees, you also had like a television studio, and like they had more people to answer to.
Yeah.
I'm not saying the Beatles didn't have anybody to answer to, but the Monkees
Not as many.
were more in the machine of what they were supposed to be doing. And I kind of feel like maybe the Beach Boys may have had, I don't know, because I don't know the whole story behind the Beach Boys, but it felt like with the little few scenes they showed with Brian Wilson's dad, like it felt like they may have been a little more controlled as far as, this is what you're supposed to be doing because this is what makes the money, not go out and be a band and do what you want to do, because that's what the Beatles did, know.
We're talking about a lot of different levels of we're talking about sort of similar levels of success. These are the things that have lasted long enough because they were well known. But I think that the success that the Beatles had was so outsized that they got to build their machine to their own specifications, and people like the Beach Boys and the Monkees couldn't do that. No matter, they wanted to in some cases, but they were never going to be able to have that pull because they didn't have that. I don't know what you want to say that the Beatles had, the trust of people, or just like, what do you call it when somebody is just like, we trust you so much, or you've made so much money for us that you have carte blanche.
Right. Yeah.
Who gets that?
The Beatles also were able to be experimental and weird, but also produce like radio hits along the way. So I think that makes a big difference too.
Yeah.
And something we talked about in the last several Monkees episodes we talked about was that, like, there's no Pleasant Valley Sunday on this album. There's no like big radio hit that's gonna carry the album.
Right.
And I think the Beach Boys went through a similar thing. There certainly were radio hits with things like Sloop John B and then later Good Vibrations, but I don't know. I think the Beatles just more successfully wove those things together of hitting those mainstream hits, but also sort of indulging their more experimental tendencies. But also, so much of it was based on Brian Wilson for the Beach Boys. Yeah. So when Brian Wilson started falling apart during the Smile Sessions, and no one else understood even what he was doing, much less like how to do it. Like, the other guys in the Beach Boys couldn't have just picked it up and done something similar.
Yeah.
Right.
Whereas I think the Beatles may have been able to more successfully do that.
Yeah.
And also, I think it may help that when the Beatles started and their fans were roughly the same age as they were, like their fans kind of were going through the same metamorphosis as the Beatles were, because all of a sudden we were getting to like the Summer of Love, and there were Vietnam War protests, and everybody was peace, love, and there were drugs. And so they kind of, I think Beatles fans kind of went along the same journey. Not all of them, but I think they were able to follow the weird trippy journey because they were doing that themselves. Where like Monkees fans we've talked about before, they were like preteen. So all of a sudden they're 16 watching Head going, this makes no sense. This is not my monkey. They weren't old enough to go on that kind of journey.
And probably relatively few of them saw Head. I think
right.
Head wasn't a film that everyone in the country rushed out to see. But certainly I think if you're a Monkees fan, you probably would have caught 33 1/3 when it came on television, because it was on television. And if you're a fan of the Monkees TV show, I can understand being disappointed by 33 1/3.
Yeah. And so I guess maybe the same would be for the Beach Boys fans. Like they were into the California beat sound, but then that's not that anymore. So, we're not ready to move to that yet. Maybe I don't know.
It is interesting. I mean, you know, it's you got. I think Elaine, you were saying something about the Beatles. Either you or Chuck, I can't remember who, but like the way that the Beatles approached it, they were unified. So I think that like whatever they would have done, we'd be telling a different story if the Beatles had kind of like faltered when it got to the point where they did Strawberry Fields and Sgt. Pepper. Like if that had fallen flat, we would totally, the Beatles would have a whole different meaning in the world today if anybody even cared anymore.
Right.
But you know, we can see like with the Monkees and with the Beach Boys, it's like there are different angles at play, and you get much more of the traditional story of like art versus commerce. It's like the Beatles got to define their I think they probably had less arguments, but probably not no arguments. There were probably some, but less arguments about what would sell.
Right.
They got to follow their muse.
Yeah. Well, and I know, like you were saying, Chuck, that like the other Beach Boys wouldn't be able to come in and pick up where Brian was going, because in the scenes in the movie when he was trying to do the different parts and was like, okay, you cellos play this, and because he heard it all in his head what he was trying to go for, and it was like mad genius, you know, scientist, but with music. And it's like, okay, this noise, and like trying to describe it, and the musicians are like, what? No, try it again, do it this. Oh, that, just keep doing that over and over and over again. It's like, okay, ding, ding, ding. I mean, you know,
that's my favorite part of the movie when Mike finally flips out and goes, he's been all day long. And now whenever the song plays, they get to that part, and I'm like,
that's her favorite part of the Beach Boys is that
yeah, but I mean, it's interesting, you know, like that whole section of the movie is such a fascinating thing. And I think other people have talked about how like one of the strengths of Love and Mercy is that so how many movies about artists don't really show you why they're regarded well as artists, and Love and Mercy shows you Brian at work and shows you the reaction of other people for better and for worse, because yes, you have the scenes where he's blowing people's minds by like saying, like, he's talking to Carol Kay the bass and like, hey, I'm playing in a different key than he is, and he's like, oh yeah, it's gonna work together, I hear it in my head. And then there's the part where he just can't get over that cello until it's right, and everybody is sitting in the control room going, what are we doing here? So for better or for worse, you see the both sides of that coin, but it is just an incredible section of the movie. And I think that when you hear they show you the exaltation of the results that come out of it and how good it is as well, so that you kind of understand where all that effort is going.
And also, I mean, they point out in the film as well, I think it's the Mike Love character that points out that like even the happy songs are sad. Like there's like this melancholy to Pet Sounds where it's not a, I mean, there are happy moments, you know, Sloop John B or something like that, but even Sloop John B is about not enjoying the trip that he's on, you know, like I want to go home. And I think that's something that was, I mean, maybe not atypical for music at that time, but not common necessarily. I don't know. I just think that Pet Sounds is an extraordinary album, and I love that they spend so much time in this film highlighting it and the people responsible for it. Because as we call the Wrecking Crew today, I know not everybody cares for that moniker. I mean, and a lot of the same studio musicians that worked on Monkees projects as well, Monkee songs as well, were involved in Pet Sounds. But I mean, I love that they highlight them and give them little character pieces in the film. Even if it's just a one line. I mean, just recently, Carol Kay was nominated or inducted to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and she has declined because I mean she doesn't like the Wrecking Crew moniker. She thinks it's insulting. And if you don't follow her on Facebook, she goes into a lot of detail about being a former like a jazz musician who became a studio musician and what the studio musicians were doing in LA at the time, and just that period, and that she doesn't feel like she should be honored for that. But I love that they get a little spotlights in the film. We had just around the same time that this film came out, or maybe it was later, maybe it was around when we got the DVD. But we had watched the Wrecking Crew documentary as well, and those two are very good companion pieces to one another because you see a lot of the same figures acted out in the film.
Yeah.
And as I pointed out when we watched this, that guy playing Hal Blaine doesn't look anything like Hal Blaine.
Right. Yeah. No. Hal Blaine looks like he could be a plumber in a different life in real life, but one heck of a drummer.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
I don't
the
remember,
Hollywood Hal Blaine. That was Hal Blaine picked that guy.
Right. Hal Blaine, I want that guy to play me if there's a movie about this podcast. But I don't remember who. I'm probably misremembering the story, but some famous drummer said he was disappointed when he got older and found out that his 5 favorite drummers were all Hal Blaine.
Something similar to that. Oh my gosh! Like when I was younger, I was on like an online chat, and I was talking about like how Paul McCartney and Brian Wilson, I really liked them and appreciated them as bass players and things, but. Someone I knew that Brian didn't play bass on everything, but like this person I was chatting with, and I was like a teenager or a really young teenager, like a tween maybe, and like the person got this like hung up that I was like trying to be a poser, like talking about how much I like Brian Wilson's bass playing, talking about the things he didn't play on, and I was like, I didn't mean to say it that way. What are you
That's the internet, though. If you
that is the internet. It's always been
your opinion wrong.
Yeah. It hasn't changed in the last 30 years.
Right. Well, but going back to the film a little bit more, I mean, what do we think about? I mean, we've talked a lot about that early period, but what do we think about John Cusack playing an older Brian Wilson?
I thought he was fantastic. Like, I haven't seen a lot of Beach Boys documentaries in general, but the few clips that I saw of Brian kind of like after he was pulled out of his bed, he was doing it pretty spot on. It was really fascinating to see the same character, but he was portrayed differently because he's a different person at that point in his life, a very different person. So it was really fascinating to watch that and see how awkward he was.
It took me a minute because I have this image of Brian Wilson in my head, and John Cusack does not look like that anywhere in my head. And so I had to kind of like let him pull me in with the character so I could kind of like overlook that the Say Anything guy with the boombox. That's somebody else, you know. So I had to get through that, but it was very sad in parts. It was kind of like, I'm like, this is a very tragic story, and I do not like Paul Giamatti's character. I wanted to throw him across the room.
He plays such a good bad guy.
I was like, I do not like you at all, and you just need to go away. Because
like the moment he steps onto the screen, you're like, oh, that guy's skeevy.
Yeah,
why you cast Paul Giamatti.
Yeah, he's very good at that role. Very good at that role.
Yeah, at the same time too. I mean, you could see sort of the perspective on like the family hiring him and giving him, because he had gotten Brian out of the bed, he'd got him down on the weight, he'd got him back active and making music again, and you know, he, as he put it in the film, it's sort of tough love of like, no, you're not hungry. You can't eat when you're not hungry.
Right.
You know, remember when you were 400 pounds or whatever and didn't get out of your bed for 3 years or whatever the case may be. But then like the more you learn about it in real life, and they portrayed in the film where like he's living in Brian's house.
Yeah.
And, you know, he's having the will changed and he's, you know, over medicating him and then trying to force him to produce music to make money. And, yeah, I mean, it certainly crosses a line. And you know, Brian hasn't seen his family in however many years, and I think Paul Giamatti plays it very well. Where I mean, from the get go, it just like you're right, it feels skeevy. But I mean, you can sort of see though how like the family would think like, I mean, after the years of Brian going through the drugs and the mental issues and the locking himself in his room and all that kind of stuff of like handing control of him over to someone who can get results.
But it almost felt like in a way that they saw the positive stuff and just took that at face value, but didn't check back in to see if it was still being a beneficial thing for Brian, because there was still money coming in. He still looked fine. They didn't get to see the behind the scene issues with him. And so that was what was really sad, that it was kind of like, okay, yes, this guy helped him initially, but he'd gone too far. He taken the power of way too much. It was kind of frustrating in a way too. Like, why is somebody not paying attention until he meets Melinda? Okay, and falls in love with her, and then she's like cracking the back wall, going, peeking behind the curtain, going, what's going on? No, this is not right. No.
And in the film, and it's not, I mean, she makes several attempts to contact the family, and it's not until she has the evidence that he has changed Brian's will that they get involved. So he's after the money. Like they're anything that they might be due from the will. You know what I mean? That's sort of the implication, is that now he's got she's got their interest, and they're gonna do something about it.
But it's just so strange that his brother didn't step in like the moment she called him, being like, or even just taking a look and to see what's going on.
Yeah, but I think there's a lot of people who have a family member or a loved one who's been through years and years of drug addiction and mental health problems and things like that, who are just relieved to have someone handling it.
Yeah.
And maybe they're afraid to look because they're afraid it's gonna start all over again, or they'll,
I had forgotten that his other brother had just died like 2 or 3 years previous to that, so he was probably still in mourning for his other brother, and he'd basically lost Brian years before to some extent. So
which is circling back to the performance, it's like that they use the information about Brian's brother Dennis dying. They don't reveal it's Dennis right away, but like the first time you see him, you're like, okay, he's sitting in this car in the Cadillac dealership, and Melinda starts talking to him, and when he finally lets his guard down and starts talking, he's like, my brother died. It's a couple years ago, but I still can't. And you're like, oh my gosh, you're immediately sympathetic to this guy, and like, what is, like,
you're also very sympathetic to Melinda, of like, what is this guy doing? Like, if you were a young female selling a car and this guy just started talking to you in a car and he had locked the doors and started talking about his brother dying, I would be creeped out. But she wasn't. That was amazing. I would have been totally skeeved out, and
I think it was an
interesting
to get
out of the
car. They definitely, the way they cut it together, I think you could tell that they played that beat of like, oh, here the doors are locking, because they, you cut to a close up, so you see it and hear it, and you're like, she does have an kind of what's going on here look on her face, but I think that, like, it's a interesting situation that you get through like their whole meeting and the first couple times they spend time together, and in other movies and other situations, you'd be like, alarm bells, red flags. But I mean, so it's a very delicate way that they portray the start of that relationship, her curiosity and compassion, without saying like, oh my God, she's just like, you could tell that she's kind of like,
she's a little bit like, but she was surprisingly calm about it. And I think that's probably why she was so good for Brian in the long run, is because she could be calm and compassionate and thoughtful about those types of things.
In the way that she's portrayed in the movie, as a sense of that she kind of is the one who steps in and breaks up the Landy monopoly, that she's a fighter. And I mean, there's the scene where Landy comes to see her at the car dealership. And she's in the office with the door closed, with the curtains pulled, and he's yelling, and she's in there, and she doesn't look like she's like totally safe, but she seems comfortable to a degree, and then she's willing to open the door and face him right on, And I think that is like how she takes on these things throughout the movie, is that she just has enough fight in her that she that she can be safer in some of these situations than the average person.
Right.
Yeah.
And that scene was on my mind as well. And I love that bit where, I mean, because Landy is like raging at the door, and as soon as she opens it and it's face to face, he shrinks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's a lot of men that are that way.
Yeah.
That, real big tough guy until it's face to face, and then he slinks away into the shadows, you know. But yeah, no, I thought the performances across the board in this film were very good. And I thought everyone looked enough, almost everyone looked enough like the person that they were playing, you know. With there's a few exceptions in there, but I thought that everyone has enough of a physical similarity to folks. And I had a similar reaction to you, Elaine, when I first saw it. Was like that John Cusack doesn't look anything like Brian Wilson, and doesn't look anything like the guy who, I said his name earlier, John. It's not Gano, but it's Dano.
Paul Dano.
Paul Dano. Thank you.
Yeah.
I know it's not Gano. Sorry. But I mean, if you look at a picture of Brian Wilson in the mid 80s, where he's more gaunt or thin with the darker hair, and it's not that far off. We're just more familiar with John Cusack, but I had a similar reaction when I first saw that he was playing him. I was like, oh, he doesn't look anything like him. But
I didn't know John Cusack well enough, or Brian Wilson really well enough when I had first seen this. I knew the hits like Elaine. I didn't.
Right.
I don't know any of the story at all whatsoever.
Yeah, I thought that they did a very good job of playing him, and I think it works here because it's two different decades of his life and two different periods of his life, having two different actors playing it. Where what was it? I'm Not There, the Brian the Bob Dylan movie, where it was a lot of different people playing him. Where I thought this worked better as a narrative where you believe it's the same person, than if it was like, you know, Kate Blanchett playing Brian Wilson or something like that. You know what I mean? Although that's a good film as well. I'm not trying to bag on that film, but I thought that here it worked better as just a narrative rather than like an art piece.
Right. Yeah. So,
well, let's talk a little.
I was going to say that I think Melinda somehow was able to see why she wasn't so weirded out when he locked the door. Like maybe she was able to sense that Brian was looking for help. I think like this was his way of trying to get somebody from the outside in somehow.
And keep the other people out where he was trying to be safe.
Because you know that like when they showed outside the window, there was somebody standing outside of the car. One of his entourage is like, "Come on, Brian, it's time to go." And he's like, "I don't want to get out of this car." Like he knew he didn't want to get out of there. He was safe there. And so I think even though it was weird, she may have picked up on that and was kind of like, okay. Plus, he just bought a Cadillac for me, so you know, hey, nice. So you know,
but there's definitely a protective element to it. Where I mean, I think she could sense from the start that he feels safer with her than he does with his bodyguards, which is not what your bodyguards are supposed to be. Your bodyguards are supposed to be the people who are protecting you, not people you're hiding from.
Right.
But I think the film is structured very well as well, because as both Brian Wilson's sort of their stories get darker. At around the same time, you know, because I mean, the John Cusack part, and I'd forgotten when I watched it, but that storyline goes to some pretty dark places for Brian as well. When he's, you know, sort of crashing in the film. But for the Paul Dano, Brian Wilson also goes through some similar things. You know, I mean, I think that it was a very good job of those different eras of Brian's life sort of playing off of each other in the film, because it would be a little bit strange if one of them was very dark and one of them was, you know, happy, you know?
Yeah.
There's enough, and you get the sense of the similar things that are happening in the different time periods that they
have similar beats.
Yeah, but similar symptoms in some case, in a lot of cases too. And I think that in addition to like being able to really portray an artist and how artists work, I think that it's a very it's a very strong movie at showing what mental illness can be like in a lot of ways too. It's I was gonna say, what's another word I thought of earlier, but I forgot. Like tactile, or like you can really feel what his experience is when he's having, you know, the way they do the sound mix and everything like that.
Right.
Yeah.
It-
Yeah.
You're feeling these like soft voices, and you think, are you hearing things? Are you hearing things? Yes.
Yeah.
And is he hearing things? Yeah.
Right.
And just popped in my head that scene at the when everybody's sitting around having dinner, and
Oh yeah.
all
And all
he
the
ends up
clinking
hearing is the
is the music of the clinking, and that's
Yeah.
it's so loud.
Yeah.
and
I can very much feel that.
yeah, I think that like a lot nowadays, everybody's definitely sympathetic to those type of things. There's a lot more of you hear a lot more in the media and from people who have experiences like that about how those things affect them, like people who are on the autism spectrum and stuff, who kind of, you know, like are hyper focused and hypersensitive. And so it's not only just a good portrayal of that particular thing, but in the combination of all the other things that are going on in his life. And to consider the fact that how could he explain that to somebody in that day and age where it wasn't as recognized, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
And it sort of begins, I mean, with him talking about, you know, what they're talking about, well, these two different bass lines work. He's like, I don't know, it works in my head, where you get the sense that while he's making pet sounds, he's hearing these sounds and trying to recreate them with the instruments that are available. And a lot of times, whether it's, you know, picking up the chords on or the
Strings.
piano, the strings on a piano with a bobby pin, or whatever the case may be,
with their bobby pins laid just right.
Right.
Yeah.
But then as it progresses and it becomes very negative for him, dealing with these sounds in his head, and you know, like, so it's introduced and like it's a more a fun, like, oh, Brian Wilson's a genius. He can hear all these things in his head, but the things in his head aren't always good.
Yeah.
You know?
Right.
And that becomes more serious as his story goes on.
Yeah. Well, now I think if I remember correctly, like the first time you really get a hint of that is like when he's on the airplane. And that was when he decided, I'm not going back out. It was kind of like, you know, and they've flown. I know they've had to have flown before, so it wasn't like first time flying, but something
triggered something. Yeah.
Yeah, snapped, and that was the beginning of all of that. Yeah. So
it's an interesting story. I think, you know, it just the timing of something like that. I was reminded of the fact that someone who was on Saturday Night Live, Jay Moore, he put out a book about his experience, and he had a lot of panic attacks, and it wasn't something that was completely new, but the experience of being on Saturday Night Live just exaggerated what was going on. And you can imagine that, like, at some point it just got to be too, you know, it scaled up for Brian, that, you know, there's a certain level of things that just all of a sudden became overwhelming.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sure. And then the level of intensity of the attention on him.
Yep.
Everywhere he goes, as the Beach Boys became more popular, you get the press and the crowds and the, you know, that's not a positive thing for everybody. And a lot of these sort of biopics, it's fun. They're being chased by girls and having to jump on top of a police car or whatever the case may be. But
it's only fun the first time it happens.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know. I'll let you know when this podcast takes off. But no, I think that I just really like the film. I think it works very well, and you really feel for his character, and you get, and like you said at the top, Derek, is you get the sort of the positives and the negatives of Brian Wilson, and I think they do a good job of that, and giving the other Beach Boys at least some opportunity to voice what their concerns with the direction and with his health. Like, for instance, I mean, they're not just a band. You know, two of them are his brothers, and one of them is his cousin, and you know, that his brothers have a genuine conversation, like, we're worried about you.
Yeah.
You know, as he's getting stranger as the movie goes on, and legitimately, I mean, if you're just as a brother, if your brother's acting that way, there's be some legitimate concern of, like, are you hearing the sounds now? You know?
Yeah.
That, and obviously that was cause for concern, because it was something that plagued him for a lot of his life.
Right.
I mean, I wanted to talk a little too. I mean, I don't want to move entirely away from the film if you guys have more to say about it, but about Brian Wilson himself, this being his birthday, and he has just recently passed away. We've only got about 15 minutes left of the show. And I know that, Derek, you've seen him more times than we have, so I figure we'll go first because we've only seen him the one time. But we saw him, I guess, after the pandemic. We made the decision to try to see a lot of these guys that we'd not seen. We saw Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr and the Beach Boys, and then Brian Wilson when he and Al Jardine and Blondie Chaplin were, I think they were Chicago.
Yeah.
So we got to see him live.
Yeah.
And I mean, he came through on the songs that he was singing, but
Oh, yeah.
we commented at the time that you noticed when we were there that he was sat behind a piano, but his hands were just in his lap. Like he was just sat behind a piano. You know,
Yeah.
we didn't see Brian, you know, at his prime, obviously, but it was amazing to be there while he's, you know, singing there live.
Yeah.
And to just be there while Brian Wilson's there in person. What did you think, Veronica?
I mean, it was amazing. Like, I mean, the fact that he wasn't playing took me out of it a little bit, because I noticed it I mean, it's not really a little thing, but I noticed things like that. But the whole time I was thinking, this sounds exactly like Brian Wilson. Like, his voice never left him. He still had the quality. He still had the tone. I know a lot of the musicians from the 60s, their voice ages and they don't sing quite as well as they used to. And I think Brian is one of the ones that held up extremely well.
Yeah, I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, but I mean, just even with him not being in his prime, though, just being there while Brian Wilson's singing "God Only Knows" is just amazing.
Yeah,
that it's something that you just want to have been there for. You know what I mean?
Exactly. Yeah.
And it's just, and to be out there and to support him and cheer for him and have that opportunity, because I can watch him and listen to him on TV or on the radio all day long, but to be there when he's singing and then be able to clap for him at the end, that's something that you only get live. You know? Now, Derek, I know that you've seen him more extensively than we have.
Yes, I'm trying to. I don't know if it's more, but at least three times, because
in once, so you got to speak.
So, and it's interesting because it's kind of like, I know you guys have seen Ringo. I never felt extremely compelled to go to a Ringo show, and I probably do need to go to the next All-Star tour. But I saw Paul at least 2 or 3 times, and so I was like really compelled to do that. And so in a similar way, like, I never went to a Beach Boys show. Maybe should have gone on the 50th tour where they got Brian back in with them.
Right.
But I went because of Brian. And just the brief backstory I was thinking of earlier, that like when I went to college, I met a guy, Tim, who he told me his favorite 3 albums of all time were Beach Boys' Pet Sounds, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and the Smiths' Meat is Murder. And I've come around on some Smith stuff. Still not a huge fan of the Smiths, but I do like a lot of the songs. But Sgt. Pepper, always loved it. But Pet Sounds, I knew some of the songs, but I kind of found it and discovered all the rest of the songs and everything like that. And it was just a couple years after that is when they released the Pet Sounds Sessions box set. It's like, at the time it was kind of unheard of. Like, here's a 4-disc set of just like all of the recordings and behind the scenes of one album.
Right.
What the heck? So that was really cool to get into. And like, I knew a lot of the hit songs, but I got more of appreciation for that record and what he was starting to do with Smile, which at that point was still very mysterious. And then so Brian Wilson in the late 90s and early 2000s started going out and touring and performing Pet Sounds. So I was like, oh my God, this is awesome. You never would have thought, like, because there was still that legend of like Brian being kind of like out of it and you know, the whole Landy thing.
Right.
So
Pet Sounds is also difficult to recreate live.
You
know, it's not your typical 2 guitars and a bass and a drum set, you know?
And that's that's a lot of the Beach Boys productions. And it's also like when you see like the videos of the Monkey Men who are now going out and doing shows, it's like you've got 4 people who are playing instruments, but then there's 2 guys in dark clothes standing off to the side because they need those 2 people to play all the other stuff that's on those records.
Right.
And in the same way, yes, Brian Wilson. I can't remember if I even really know the whole backstory of like how they all came about it, but he ended up working with these guys who had a band called the Wonderments that was very inspired by the Beach Boys and Brian Wilson. And for all these years, the members of the Wonderments have been like the core of the Brian Wilson band that have helped him to recreate those sounds live and worked with him to finish Smile by having like all of the bootlegs and recordings of that stuff available for Brian to hear and to kind of like piece it back together himself and to play it with them and all that kind of stuff. So like, yes, those tours. So there was the one of the early Pet Sounds tours I saw, and then he finished Smile and he went out on a tour with that. And I just remember like that being a fantastic show. And it's not only just seeing Brian there, but having like all of the fantastic musicians, and like you have to have so many musicians to play Smile.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like going to see like a symphony play, you know, they have to get all that stuff. And then on the same tour that you guys did, except but it wasn't one of the co-shows with Chicago. It was a Pet Sounds only show with Al Jardine and Blondie Chapman. And I was looking back. I actually looked back because I was like, you guys, like I said, I got my Brian Wilson shirt on. I looked back to see, like, did I wear this shirt when I went to see Brian? Because I bought the VIP. And it was like they ushered you in, they signed the stuff, and they took a picture of you with them, with Brian, Allen, Blondie. And I looked at the picture, and Brian is like smiling huge. He's like, you know, you see a lot of pictures of Brian kind of like a little out of it, kind of looks like, but but when he's on. And during those pictures, he had such a grin on his face, and I was like, that's great. I got a picture of Brian in a good moment. Yeah. And so it's that's pretty cool. And like,
were you wearing the same shirt?
No. It was similar, but it was like a black and white print type shirt with flowers. It was a different one. Yeah, so like he's not you can even hear it if you like track down interviews that like he hasn't been the same over the years. There were times during the Landy period or like right after the Landy period where he sounded more eloquent and had a better singing voice, and it didn't last. And it seems like, you know, there've been a lot more stories about like Brian kind of being on and off a lot more in the later years and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So he hasn't been able to perform like as he always has. But when he started off on the journey of doing live shows, it was quite an amazing thing to hear. He could sing most of the songs. But they did, you know, they got good musicians to play along and kind of like supplement his voice so that it sounded like it needed to recreate those songs. And I mean, there are multiple voices on all those recordings in the first place. You know, everybody's double tracking and harmonizing on everything on those records. So it doesn't sound too far out of the ordinary for someone to kind of supplement Brian's voice. Yeah. So just the overwhelming sense of like, oh my God, I'm so glad I got to see Brian Wilson.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and with Smile in particular, the sort of catharsis I would imagine of knowing the story behind it and being able to see him up there presenting a finished version. I'm gonna do finished in air quotes because there's no telling what it would have been in the 60s. And there's fan edits where they've combined. I've got one on my phone where they've combined the Smile sessions with the Smile album with Brian Wilson, putting more of the Beach Boys voices in and things like that, and changing the track listing based on something a photo of a list of songs from 19. You know what I mean? Where fans are still obsessed with Smile. But no, I think it's great that he was able to go out and tour and do those songs live. And like I said, when we saw him, obviously it was past his prime, but we knew that when we went. But it was just nice to be able to go out there and see him, and like I said, to applaud for him and just be there while he was singing. Now I know that Mike Love has sort of alleged that Melinda was as controlling as Landy was, that sort of Brian wasn't behind a lot of this stuff. But I mean, I don't know that. But Mike Love's always saying something. You know what I mean? So I don't know. But I think for him, I'm glad that he was able to finish that. in some capacity, and to go out and to get the recognition he deserves. Because I mean, like I say, it was like we saw in the film, the Beach Boys weren't necessarily bowled over by Pet Sounds necessarily, and then it wasn't the big hit at the time that I felt like it should have been. So that he was able to go out and see all the fans and people coming to the Pet Sounds and living long enough to see Pet Sounds being regarded as a classic album and a masterpiece in a lot of people's estimations, mine included. That I think that's great, because a lot of times you'll have these misunderstood artists who don't live long enough. And Brian Wilson certainly could have been one of those, because he went through some pretty dark times, you know, where it's kind of amazing that Brian Wilson lived until last week.
Outlived his other brothers.
Right. Considering everything that he went through in his life.
Right.
Yeah. Now, Elaine, had you gotten to see Brian Wilson live?
No, I never did. So.
Okay.
No.
Did you see the Beach Boys live?
No.
When we saw the Beach Boys live, my big takeaway was Mike Love's reaction to your chest.
I was thinking about that.
that has been in my brain.
Like when you were mentioning Mike Love and kind of his reaction to things, I was thinking like, yeah, well, he said, wow. I don't know how much of it was because I had a weird suntan line.
You had a bad sunburn.
I had a really bad sunburn because we were outside in Florida in a low cut shirt and I hadn't put any sunscreen on.
Also a very low cut outfit, so it could go either way.
Yes,
but
or both.
And I've been sort of playing devil's advocate for Mike Love during this podcast, but that's sort of my impressions of Mike Love versus Brian Wilson. Is sitting in awe of Brian Wilson and then thinking it's funny that Mike Love noticed my wife's chest.
If let's charitably just say, like, Mike Love is a man of contradictions.
Well, do anyone have any other thoughts about it? I mean, we've got 2 minutes left. As we wrap this up, I mean, I appreciate everybody getting together. We watched the film just with the idea of doing a bonus episode for the podcast. Then obviously it became more serious when we learned that Brian Wilson passed away. And then I was out of town for a week, but it just happened to work out that his birthday would have been today. So we seemed like a good opportunity to get together to honor him. And I hope that our Monkees, fellow Monkees fans will go along with us on that. And I know that they'll not be mad at us that we're not talking about just about the Monkees this week. But, I mean, as far as the music of the 60s goes, Brian Wilson was one of the most influential people around. And it's similar to the Monkees in that the Beach Boys started off as a very pop, fun, silly, fun songs. And he was able to take it more serious and turn it into artistry in a different way. And I think in a very successful way. And I think that I wish that he could have continued in the I would have loved to have seen what the Beach Boys could have been if they'd have followed that Pet Sounds path for a few more years, like the Beatles had the opportunity to do.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I will share, like, I sent in our group chat thing this information yesterday, but I saw it on Facebook and I was like, oh, that's pretty cool too. That yesterday, the day before Brian Wilson's birthday, was the anniversary of the release of the film Love and Mercy. Also, Paul Dano's birthday.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yes. I think I missed that it was his birthday, but I did see that yesterday.
I missed that it was the release day. I only saw the birthday. So Elaine, between the two of us.
Yeah, we'll get it going.
Yeah, the stars are aligning. So if you're out there and you've not seen Love and Mercy, check it out.
Yep.
If you're out there and you've not heard Pet Sounds, like, turn this off right now and go listen to Pet Sounds.
Do that before you watch Love and Mercy.
I was just listening. There's this YouTube React guy. You know how they have the YouTube React people. And this guy is like Gen Z music producer who's apparently never heard music before like 2006 because he's never heard anything. But he was listening to Pet Sounds and reacting to it. And the thing that he kept saying all through the thing, he kept pausing it and saying, like, what is that instrument? And trying to figure out what sounds he was hearing.
It's probably not actually an instrument.
Actually, you're talking about how weird is this album. There are some things on there that you like wouldn't stuff. The bass harmonica, right, and the some of the like you said, some of the sounds are things are normal, but when you're plucking the strings of a piano with bobby pins, it doesn't sound like a traditional instrument,
right?
Or there's oboes and other things that don't get as much of a bicycle horns.
Yeah.
Back when they were doing it all analog.
Yeah.
Where it wasn't just digitally manipulating things or using synthesizers. I mean, making these incredible songs with these strange sounds, and it's just I just love it. If I listen to Pet Sounds, it's like crank all the way up. I can't listen to it with Veronica in the car because she'll tell me to turn it down. And
Bothering my sleep.
Well, thank you guys.
Thank you.
Do you want to wrap this up, Veronica?
Yeah. Derek, where can people find more of you on the internet?
You can find me, let's see, at Minorworks on Instagram. I've been posting a little more on there lately. We've got the Monkees on Mixing Links, the Monkees on Disc group on Facebook, and mixinglinksbook.com.
And how about you, Elaine?
You can find me on Facebook and Blue Sky at Monkeeing Around, and on Instagram too, but I forget about it. You can email us at monkeyingaroundpodcast@gmail.com. But then you can also find me on Facebook and Blue Sky at Elaine and Matt Watch TV, where I chronicle what me and my husband Matt are watching on TV.
Awesome. And how about us, Chuck?
Well, for this podcast, we'll be back soon with the second part of our new Monkees episode. I know it's been a while, but life has been a little bit busy, so we'll be back before too long with that. And then this one will go out as a podcast as well. You can also find Felt Nerdy, our puppetry production and performance group, on social media at Felt Nerdy, or for our adult-only content at Felt Nerdy and Dirty. You can find us live if you're watching this tonight on Friday, June the 20th. Tomorrow at 6:30, we'll be in Dalton, Georgia, performing at Metrotham Con. We also have some library shows coming up in July and some other stuff coming up after that. You can also find us on our Star Trek podcast that goes out weekly on Thursdays at 8 p.m. Eastern on YouTube, and then after the fact on your favorite podcast platform. It's called Earth Station Trek. Just recently, just last night, you guys did a really interesting discussion about mental health awareness as it's portrayed in Star Trek over the years,
which was very interesting because we ended up talking about mental health tonight.
Yeah, and sort of how it mirrors the way mental health was perceived by the public at the time. And I thought that was a very interesting conversation, and you guys are going to be going back to for a second part of that soon. We haven't nailed the date down yet on that, but check out Earth Station Trek on your favorite podcast platform or on YouTube, and you can follow Monkeeing Around. If you're listening to the audio podcast, we're trying to do more of these YouTube things so you can see our smiling faces. And if you're watching on YouTube for the first time, follow the Monkeeing Around podcast because we have a whole bunch of episodes that are not about Brian Wilson, but about the Monkees. But if you like 60s pop culture, we get quite a bit of that in there as well.
All right. Thanks for monkeying around.